Uh, Welcome to PNACAC's third webinar in our Counseling 101 series. Today's topic is the Fafsa. We're so glad you all joined us today. If you're new to this series, thank you for joining us. If you're an old hat, you've been here a couple times, welcome back. As a reminder, this series, or this webinar, excuse me, is being recorded. And so you'll have access to that later in case you want to go back and review some of the topics that we'll be presenting on today. But please know we have a little bit of a delay in getting that webinar recording out to you. It will probably reach you by next week. So watch your emails from PNACAC for that email. And then those of you taking this class for credit through NNU, you'll also have access to week 3's assignment, which basically is the same assignment you've had the last 2 weeks, but we just need you to have that new link for the answers you'll be putting in that form. So unfortunately, Patrick O'Connor was not able to join us this morning, but we do have a very, very special guest speaker who is joining us. And we learned just probably about an hour ago that Patrick couldn't join us, so we so greatly appreciate her. And so I'm going to turn this over to Palmer because he is going to introduce our special speaker.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ray. Yeah, we're so happy that y'all can join us today. We're so happy that it's not a PSA testing day today. So first of all, just a little bit of housekeeping. When we're done, we'll have time for Q&A. Please feel free to put questions into the Q&A here, and then Ray and I can go through those at the end as time allows. The other thing is the chat is disabled for you, but we may put messages in there for you. So keep an eye on the chat, but it's not a function that you can use. So yes, little curveball this morning, as Patrick said, he had a situation that was just unavoidable. I understand it was medical related and so couldn't join us. But fortunately, I had reached out to Ashley Monroe. And Ashley is the financial aid director at my institution, the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And I had said, Ashley, would you mind just logging in for this webinar? Because financial aid is always so much more complex than anyone realizes. And you can just kind of be our safety net in case, in case there's questions that are above our pay grade. And she was real gracious and said, absolutely. And then about an hour ago, I texted her and said, could you actually present this morning? And even gave her permission to say no. And she said, no problem. So let me introduce Ashley to you. Ashley Monroe is the Director of Financial Aid at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And she's been working in financial aid since about 2008. She's well known and recognized in state and national financial aid organizations. She served on the National Association for Student Financial Aid Administrators Board of Directors. She has been past president of the Western Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. You think PNACAC's tough, try WASFA. That's a lot of acronyms too. And she's been a regional trainer for federal financial aid programs for 12 years. And so with that, we'll get out of the way and let you take over, Ashley. Thank you so much for stepping in.
Thank you. Yes.
No problem. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. I enjoy talking about financial aid, and training is one of my passions as well. So let me go ahead and share my screen here for a moment. And I am hoping you can see, yep, that's the right screen. Just needed to double check myself. So we're going to be talking about the Fafsa, some of the basics as we prepare for the 2023-2024 Fafsa. So what we're going to be covering here today is taking a look at what the Fafsa is, what's the difference between the idea of Fafsa and paying for college, and some of the common mistakes that happen with the Fafsa. I am an informal presenter, so I want to pay attention to questions that you have when you have them. So please don't hesitate about putting questions in the Q&A feature, and I'm going to rely on our moderators here to help to let me know when we do have a question so that we can stop and address it. And I do plan to have time at the end for questions as well. But I want you to be able to leave this presentation today with most of your questions answered and to have resources on where you can contact to get the rest of them answered. We want you to be able to help students complete the FAFSA. It is a complicated form. It can be intimidating, and the FAFSA numbers are decreasing. And so we want to broaden the availability of help for people that can help with the FAFSA. So when we're talking about the FAFSA, we're talking about the free application for federal student aid. The FAFSA itself is an application. We do get families and students that don't know exactly what FAFSA is. They know it's somewhat associated with going to college, but it's actually just a piece of paper or an online application form that students fill out with their families, and it indicates how much their family can contribute to college. It is available at studentaid.gov. And what it does is it collects a picture that lets the federal government be able to compare and provide equity across states, across income levels, and across family situations to see who is able to pay for college and who needs assistance from the federal government. Now, this is, of course, I think we all know that complete equity is not possible, but this is the best option available that still helps determine where families are in their ability to pay for college using what small resources exist at the federal level as well as the state level. So when we talk about the FAFSA, it is the application for federal student aid, which includes grants, student loans, and federal work study. It's also used by most states to provide some sort of state financial assistance. So that could be a state scholarship program, a state grant, a promise program. Those are going to require the FAFSAs as well. It's also used by most colleges. The colleges who participate in those programs will use the FAFSA as well as perhaps another form, a CSS profile form or some other type of institutional form to determine eligibility for institutional aid. And that could be a scholarship program at your school, needs-based awards. It could be your foundation awards or your privately funded scholarships may also require the FAFSA. The last thing to note is that it's free. That first word in there is free. There are sites and services out there that will offer to a student to complete the FAFSA for a fee. And please know that a student should never pay for the FAFSA and should never pay for any sort of financial aid, including scholarships. All of those resources should be available for free to students, and there are resources that can help. Here, the FAFSA can be intimidating. Back when it was a paper form, you would unfold it, it would be 3 feet long, front and back. But the online form is continually getting streamlined. We're reducing questions, and there's lots of resources that are available to help. Just about every state has some sort of FAFSA filing program or push with free workshops. Most schools and your financial aid offices or a local financial aid office is going to be more than willing to walk a student through the FAFSA, even if you're not going to your local school. So we encourage all students to make sure that they're not paying for any of these resources. To complete the FAFSA, you do have to create a federal student aid account. And a student and a parent will need to do this, and they do have to be separate accounts outlined with separate email accounts. And so some parents who maybe are struggling with email or don't have an email account may need to have some assistance in order to get an FSA account. But this is how a student and their parent will sign the FAFSA securely. They create this FSA, Federal Student Aid account, username and password, and that stays with them for the next 4 years. So they want to make sure that when they're choosing all of their security questions and all of that, it's something that's not going to change. My example is the one question for security questions that I dread is when it asks what your favorite color is, because my favorite color changes every day. So I'm never going to remember what answer I put in that security question. So that's something to keep in mind for students and parents as well. They can create before completing the FAFSA or waiting until the end when the FAFSA is ready for signature. And this account, stays with the student for multiple years so that they can complete the FAFSA every year. It also is their login when they want to take out student loans and they need to do the additional paperwork for loans. It's also their account when they finish school and they want to review their student loan history or see who their servicers are. So this account stays with them for the next 4 to 10 years, however long it takes them to get all the way through the system. The parent account also stays the same for parents who want to take out a loan on behalf of their student or parents who have multiple students in college. They can use the same account for each one of their students. It's helpful to have a book or a folder or somewhere that you can put your FSA username and password. Of course, there are always options for forgot password, but they are trying to keep that secure. So that can be really frustrating and time consuming for families who have forgotten a password. The next thing I want to discuss is just what the FAFSA looks like. So it's going to ask for student demographics, parent demographics, financial information, dependency status, and we're going to talk about dependency status a lot today, and then the colleges that the student is applying to, and then it's going to ask for those electronic signatures. When it comes to colleges that you're applying to on the FAFSA, a student can list up to 10 colleges the first time around, and then they can add additional colleges by logging into their FSA account after the FAFSA has been submitted. So if they're really not sure, they change their mind, they put their initial list of colleges in, and then 2 months later, this really cool college comes up and they want to make sure that that school gets their FAFSA, they can simply log into the FSA account and add a school. They need to include at least one school in their submission form. And so if they're not sure where they're going to want to go, a student can put just the local school to start to get information and then always log in at a later date. Schools will get their FAFSA information. Some schools will actually do something with it right away. Other schools are going to wait until the student completes their admissions application. And that's going to be dependent upon usually the philosophy and the ability to process of that particular school. So something to keep in mind. But let's talk more about dependency status, because this is probably one of the #1 questions when it comes to completing the FAFSA and one of the most frustrating points. So dependency status is what Congress has defined as whether a student needs to provide parent information or not on the FAFSA. And it doesn't necessarily represent a student's ability to pay or support on their own. And so generally speaking, students must report parent income unless they are at least 24 years old or going to turn 24 during the fall of their year in college. They can be married, less than 24 and be married. They could be a graduate or professional student, meaning that they have a bachelor's degree already. They could be a veteran or on active duty in the armed forces and be considered independent. They could be an orphan or a ward of the court. They could be in a legal guardianship and have the documentation to prove that they're in a legal guardianship. Or they can be an emancipated minor or someone who is homeless or is at risk of being homeless. This is where it creates a lot of confusion because we hear from a lot of students who maybe don't meet this criteria. They may be 22 and on their own, they've been working, they live in an apartment, they're providing their own support, paying their own bills, their parents aren't giving them money to pay for college. That student, if they don't meet any of these criteria, is still considered dependent, meaning that they have to provide their parents' information on the FAFSA. And this can be a frustrating hurdle for some students and some families who struggle in this particular area. So I want to make sure if you have particular questions, we're going to talk a little bit more about dependency status and parents on the FAFSA. But if you do have questions, I want to make sure that you know that Q&A option is available and we can talk about some specifics if you have them. It is also important to note that for a lot of schools, if a student does say that they are an orphan, ward of the court, have legal dependents, or is an emancipated minor or homeless, the college or university financial aid office may need to verify that status. And verification of that status could be the court documentation, the legal guardianship papers, proof from a homeless shelter, something in that particular realm. And that's the case of many schools, because so many students do get this question incorrect on the FAFSA. They're asked yes or no questions, but students don't always know what a ward of the court means. Or sometimes we even have students who put down that they're a graduate student because they're graduating high school. So yeah, they graduated, they're a graduate student. Or they're going into a professional program, so they think they're a professional student when that's not the case. So another one of my favorites is when students list their biological parents and they say, oh, my parent is my legal guardian, so I'm in a legal guardian. A legal guardianship. And so there's a lot of things that can get answered incorrectly on the FAFSA, which is why financial aid offices will verify most dependency status for students who are under 24 and not married. And that documentation, your financial aid office will work on that. And I
Actually,
do see,
yeah, I was just going to ask, do you want to get down into the weeds with this right now with a couple of these questions, or would you prefer to hold off?
Nope, let's get down in the weeds with these. So I see Haley has asked what qualifies a student as homeless for FAFSA purposes. There's a couple of different definitions of homeless when it comes to dependency status. The first is that if a student lacks fixed and adequate housing. And that can be determined in one of two ways. One, a student can have proof that they have been seeking assistance from a homeless shelter since I think it's July 1st of the previous year, anytime during that period, and the financial aid office can claim that student as homeless. The other option too is that a financial aid officer has the authority to determine if a student is homeless, and that usually is a written statement from a student, perhaps some supporting documentation, such as a written statement from someone who knows about the situation. And that could be a high school counselor, a teacher, someone in the community that knows what has been going on and that the student does not have adequate and fixed housing. So a student who is couch surfing from house to house could be considered homeless, even though they have a place to lay down every night. It's not fixed and it's not adequate, and they could be considered homeless. Taylor asked that follow-up questions. Are students asked to prove homeless status? And at many institutions and in many situations, yes, there needs to be some sort of documentation to that effect. And it's not that we're trying to claim that the student is lying, but we do need to be able to have some sort of confirmation of this particular thing, because this question is often answered incompletely, incorrectly, or there may be a better solution to the situation. Here at my school, we get a handful of students who say they're at risk for being homeless, and we walk them through a different version of dependency override, which we're going to talk about at the end, which is actually easier for them to accomplish from year to year as opposed to homeless. So it's in their best interest to go a different route than to select the homelessness question. And we'll walk them through that. Sylvie asks, where does foster care youth fit in with dependency? And thank you for asking that question, because a student who is in foster care, orphan, or a ward of the court after age 13 can answer that question as yes, and they are not required to provide parental information on the FAFSA. And so if they were in foster care, a ward of the court, or orphaned before the age of 13, and they have maybe since been adopted, then unfortunately they do have to use their adoptive parents on the FAFSA. But someone who is in that situation after the age of 13, it doesn't matter if they've been adopted or what other situation may exist, they could be back with their biological parents. If it happened after the age of 13, they are considered independent, and they do not need their parents' information on the FAFSA. So great question. So now I want to point out, just to get you ready for the next slide here, is some of the ones to talk about that we're going to be focused on. students are independent if they are over the age of 24 or have a legal dependent, and that could be a child or married. So one of the things that I want to do is actually do a dependency status pop quiz. Yay, don't you love pop quizzes on an early morning? Well, early morning for some of us. We're gonna play a round of Simon Says. And so you should have the ability, I think, to raise your hand. And that's what I'm gonna ask. So Simon says, raise your hand if, when I read the scenario, the student is independent, and you're going to lower your hand if the student is dependent. So independent means that they do not need parents' information, and dependent means that they do need parents' information. I think I said that correctly. Independent, no parents, dependent, parents. So raise your hand if they're independent. So Simon says that I'm a student and I am 18 and I am living at home with my parents. Am I independent or dependent? And dependent. So you want to keep your hands lowered for this one. So a dependent student, if I'm 18 and living at home with my parents, I am going to need my parents' information on the FAFSA. But now I'm 19 and I'm married. Am I independent? Oh, I see lots of hands going up. Awesome. Yay, most of you have raised your hands. That's fantastic. Yes, as soon as the student becomes married, they are now independent. They don't need their parents' information on the FAFSA, but they do need their spouse's information on the FAFSA. And so that can sometimes even be lower their eligibility for aid, depending upon what kind of job the spouse may have. All right. Oops, now I'm 20 and I'm divorced. I see some hands going up. I see some hands going down. This one's a little bit harder. Yeah, so if I'm 20, I'm under 24, and I'm divorced, I'm no longer married. So I would be a dependent student. I would have to provide information on my parents, even if I wasn't living at home anymore. I am dependent. I can't say that I'm married. I'm 20, I'm divorced, and I'm pregnant. I live at home and my parents provide my support. Am I independent or dependent? Oh, again, I see lots of hands going up and I see lots of hands going down. So in this case, I am most likely dependent. So I am under the age of 24. I am not married, but I'm pregnant. However, if my parents are providing my support, they're also providing the support of my baby to be. And so I'm not providing the financial support for that child, and therefore can't say that I support that child more than 50% of the time. So I don't have a legal dependent that I support. So in this case, parents' information would be required. I'm 21 and I have a baby and I live at home and my parents provide my support. Am I independent or dependent? These are getting a little bit harder. I definitely see some changes, some slower situations. So in this case, once again, I am dependent. So it's the same situation as if I was pregnant, that my parents are providing the financial support for me and my child. And so my parents' information is required on the FAFSA. All right, we're progressing a little more. I am 22, I have a toddler, I move out and live on my own. Am I dependent or independent? Awesome, I see hands going up. In this case, I am independent. I moved out, I live on my own. I live my own, what, I would assume means that they're providing their own financial support. So I am an independent student. I don't need my parents' information on the FAFSA. Okay, I am 23. I live on my own. I have a toddler, but that toddler lives with my ex-spouse who provides most of the support. Am I dependent or independent? the tough one. I again see hands going up, hands going down. In this case, I would most likely be dependent. So I'm under 24. I don't have any children that I provide most of the support for. So it's more than just having a child. It's about having a child and providing more than 50% for that child, 50% of the support for that child. So in this case, I would be dependent. So I hope that answers some of your questions. I'm going to check the Q&A just to see if there's anything else. Josh asked a follow-up to the homeless question. So once they get to college and live in a dorm, are they no longer homeless and then need parent information for the year? In that case, the Department of Education has defined that living in residence halls at a college campus does not negate the homelessness situation. So if the student was not living in the dorms, do they have a place to go for Thanksgiving break, Christmas break? If they can go home to their parents and the parents have fixed adequate housing, that would mean that the student is not homeless. But if they have nowhere to go outside of the dorms, then they could still be considered homeless or at risk for homeless. All right, so now that we've talked about dependency status and we've ended on a situation where a student is dependent, meaning they need parents' information, let's talk about who is a parent. That's not an easy question. So who's my parent when I fill out the FAFSA? It is not always biological mom, biological dad who live together and are married, and therefore it's easy to determine who is parent one and parent two on the FAFSA. There are a lot of individual circumstances in regards to what constitutes as a family. So the Federal Student Aid has published this nice handout sheet that you can find online if it's something that you want to print out and have a reference to. But it's essentially a flowchart that can help families figure out who is going to be the parent. So the first stage is usually looking for one person, one adult who the student considers a parent, whether that's a step parent, a biological parent, adopted parent, who is willing to provide and able to provide the information on the FAFSA, and starting with that question of, is that person married? And yes, they have to report information on so if they're married, they have to report information on the FAFSA for both parents. If their parents they're not married, but they live together, then they do need to provide both parents on the FAFSA. But if they're not married and they don't live together, then it's essentially who provides the most support for that particular student. So who does the student live with most of the year, during the week versus weekends, or during the week versus the summer? Who does the student live with? We often hear of situations where it's like, well, we're equal. We're 1 week on, 1 week off, so it's equal. But in reality, there are 365 days in the year, most years. So there's an extra day. Who provides the most support financially? Who's the house they live in the most? That's going to be the parent of record on the FAFSA. Step parents information is required if a student is, or if a parent is married. So this comes back to right here, actually. Has this parent remarried? Yes. So step parent information is required on the FAFSA. Has the parent remarried? No. Then that parent reports singly. And this has to be done, and this has to be followed no matter what a divorce decree determines. So it could be that dad in the divorce decree gets the right to provide or claim the child on the FAFSA, on the taxes. It doesn't matter. Mom could still be the parent on the FAFSA if they follow this flowchart, and mom is the parent that they lived with the most. So it doesn't matter who claims who on the taxes. It matters who provides that financial support and what that parent's marital status is. It's a tough one, and this is one that if you do have these unique situations, then we need to work closely with the financial aid office in these situations, but you are usually the person who is having these conversations with students. You know more about the situations, the families are telling you more things. Financial aid offices, for some reason seem scary and people don't want to talk to us, but we're not scary people. Make sure that you encourage students, families to reach out to the financial aid office, or that you can be that buffer and ask these questions on their behalf. And we're happy to let you know who is going to be able to do this, and who is going to be the parent of record on the FAFSA. Okay, let me just check. Brandy asked if they're going to have access to this flow chart. It is available online if you do a quick Google of which parent on the FAFSA, but I will I'm happy to send it to Palmer, and if that's something that Palmer can send out to you all, that's perfectly fine as well. So once you figure out who, Palmer, you want to?
No, that was me trying to look for the thumbs up emoticon and I missed it.
Sounds good. All right. So it sounds like he's going to send that out to you guys. Beyond the parents on the FAFSA, and once you figure all of that out, what else is required? So we're going to be looking for income information from the tax year that is considered the prior year to when the student is applying. So for the 2023-2024 FAFSA, we're looking at the 2021 tax information. So it's the most recent completed year from when the FAFSA opened. And that 23-24 FAFSA opened on October 1st. So students don't have their 2022 taxes yet. They're not going to have that for another 4 to 6 months. And so that's why we look for 2021 taxes. Those should already be completed, even with the initial automatic extension. Those deadlines have passed. So everyone should have their 2021 tax year status, with the exception of a few people who qualify for additional tax extensions. So we need that from the student. We also need other income from the student. So this could be information that's not reported on taxes. It could be in-kind services, money paid under the table, untaxed income. That is all asked on the FAFSA. In addition, then, if a student is a dependent, we need information from the 2021 tax year for that parent and maybe step parent. And then this is a typo and I apologize, other income from 2021 for the parent, not the student. We already had the student, so we need that from the parent. Other untaxed income is going to be things like IRA distributions, money paid on their behalf. So if someone's paying your bills for you, that does get reported on the FAFSA. It could be tax deferred pension plans, earned income from work is going to be what's going to be on your tax status. It could be combat pay for members of the military, housing for members of the military and members of the clergy. It could be veterans non-education benefits, so veteran disability. All of those things are going to be questions that are asked on the FAFSA. Once you submit the FAFSA, oops, I apologize, I skipped ahead too fast. Once you submit the FAFSA, the student is going to receive a confirmation page where they can review the information that they've provided. That confirmation page is also going to list the EFC, which is the expected family contribution. And the EFC represents a dollar amount, even though there's not a dollar sign in front of it. But that EFC is what schools will use. It's what levels out the playing field, essentially. It's what the federal government and Congress has defined as this represents where we are trying to find equity amongst students in similar situations. That EFC is the dollar amount that schools will use to determine what they are eligible to receive. And the lowest EFC available this year is 0, and that has been for several years. Also on the confirmation page, the student will have access to the schools that they provided, the school's graduation rate and transfer out rate, which can be scary sometimes. And then access to a student aid report usually comes a few days later, up to 3 days later, the student will receive an email which directs them to log back into their FSA account to view their student aid report. Their student aid report is going to have line by line what they provided on the FAFSA. It's going to list if there have been any inconsistencies. So if the student skipped a question, if they have some sort of weird situation, we call them C flags in financial aid world. It means comment codes or oh crap codes. The student needs to do something. They're called C flags. And the C flag would be listed on the student's aid report. And this could be an example where the student maybe answered a tax information question wrong. Numbers aren't adding up. The student has been flagged for a process called verification. This will all be on the student aid report. This printed student aid report is often needed for many outside scholarships, particularly Bureau of Indian Affairs scholarships. Students will need to provide a copy of their student aid report. It's it's common enough that students should know how to access their student aid report and even print it to a PDF from their FSA account and keep it handy. Once the FAFSA is submitted and processed, schools, the selected schools on the FAFSA, are going to receive an ISER record, which is an institution student information record. This is basically the student aid report, but it's worded differently and it's worded for schools. And that is what a school will receive and use to compile a financial aid offer. And so all of that information that's in the student aid report is also in that ISER, which is sent to the school. So that's where a school will pull it. We'll look at all of those C flags and start to send students information on what they may need to do to complete their FAFSA. Some important things to note here is that next year, the FAFSA is going to be drastically different. This is both exciting and scary in the financial aid world. So for the 2024-2025 FAFSA, we have questions going from over 100 questions down to 36. The EFC will no longer exist, and it will be known as the Student Aid Index. And that Student Aid Index can be less than 0. It can go down to minus 1,500. It'll still be used, the Student Aid Index will still be used to provide that level playing field to make sure that students in similar situations are covered in the same way, but it's more of an index as opposed to family contribution number. So the wording has changed a little bit. There's also some changes coming to other areas of terminology. So things like room and board are no longer going to exist, and they will be called housing and food to more accurately reflect what students are thinking about. I've had conversations with a lot of students who don't know what board means, which is the meal plan or the food bill. And so call it what it is. We're going to call it food instead of board. Let me check in here on, oh, thank you. Someone provided a link to that file that we can share too. Haley asks, will the student aid index be used in the same way as EFC? Yes, the student aid index will be used in the same way as EFC. It's really more of a terminology change. I mean, the calculation is going to be different, but we're going to use it in the same way to determine financial need and to build on what a student is eligible for.
Ashley, I'm kind of curious, and this is getting down in the weeds maybe, but do you know what the implications are of a negative SAI next year? Will that be the same as a 0?
Yep. You just asked the question that every financial aid officer has been wondering about since this got announced 2 years ago. I think it's meant to show that schools need to provide extreme need to these students. The question becomes, where do schools get money to do this? Do we, anyone who has a negative 1,500, do we give them a base $1,500 scholarship to get them to 0 and then we start from there? Schools who have a lot of resources will probably do something like that. Other schools are trying to figure out what that's going to mean, and it's probably going to be a long-term process. We probably have to see what it means and how it works before we can build a system around that, because we don't have test data to tell us how many of our students are going to have a minus $1,500 student aid index. It's a good question. We don't know how it's going to work yet. We will find out in about 1 year what we're going to do. Allison asks, is there guidance on how to direct students when their parents have divorced this past year? So that's a good question, Allison. So when the student is completing the FAFSA, it's going to ask for the marital status as of the day that they complete the FAFSA. The FAFSA is meant to be a snapshot in time. So it's going to ask as of the day they complete the FAFSA. So if they're divorced that day, then only one parent's information is going to be required on the FAFSA. If they filled out the FAFSA and then get divorced, we're going to cover that in just a few minutes. Let's see. Amber also asked if after a student's family submits the FAFSA with their 10 colleges listed, will each college reach out to the family with individual offers? And this could be right away or after they submit their application for admission. Yes. So each school that receives the FAFSA should have some sort of financial aid offer. Now, some schools will go ahead and create a financial aid offer right away to get that out to students to try to be a recruitment tool to entice them to apply for admissions. Other schools will wait until they have an admissions application matched up and that the student has been admitted to the school, and then process a financial aid offer and send it to the student and family. So it's not a great answer, but it's kind of it depends. Check with, if you work at a college, check with your admissions and financial aid office to figure out what they do. If you work at a high school or just in general, maybe check with the local colleges or the top colleges that your students are interested in to find out what their process is. It's probably about a 50-50 split. Let's talk about some of the top 10 FAFSA mistakes. This is also a graphic that you can get online, and I'll share this also with Palmer so he can share it with you. Really, it comes down to not filling out the FAFSA form, not filling it out by a deadline, and not filling it out correctly. It's kind of obvious, right? Your top 10 FAFSA mistakes, and half of them are that you don't fill it out or that you don't fill it out by a deadline. That's really the key. As I mentioned before, FAFSA filing rates across the country have plummeted since, especially since the pandemic. They're slowly coming back up, but we are nowhere near the rates that we were seeing before COVID. Students are struggling to get access to the form. Schools are so busy with everything else that comes into getting students graduated that they're not able to provide assistance with the FAFSA. Schools are still struggling with in-person events. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why the FAFSA filing rate is low, but it is across the country. There are a handful of states that are up, and all of those states are the ones that require the FAFSA to be filed before a student can actually graduate from high school. Which I think there's 3 or 4 states now. Those are the only ones that have seen remain steady at FAFSA filing rates. There's lots of programs out there to help you get the FAFSA completed. I know my school is doing tons of virtual workshops, in-person workshops. We've dedicated a lot of money to FAFSA outreach and postcards, and yet it's still low, and we're trying to figure out how to make that a little bit easier, and that FAFSA Simplification Act that comes into play next year will hopefully help push those FAFSA filing rates back up. Pay attention to deadlines in your own state. While the federal deadlines, I mean, the FAFSA doesn't exactly have a deadline. The hard deadline is actually after a student would have completed school for the academic year. But a lot of states have deadlines. So for example, there's some deadlines that are in February, some deadlines that are in April, some deadlines that are in May and June, all for state financial aid. So you'd want to check with your state, and the FAFSA website does have a pretty good listing of state deadlines. So they do vary. Ideally, where we financial aid officers want to see the FAFSA filed is between October 1st when it becomes available and the end of February. That is prime financial aid application season. And what I like to say is that financial aid can be scary, so you want to fill it out sometime around Halloween, or you love money, and so you want to fill it out around Valentine's Day. So those are the key. Between Halloween and Valentine's Day is your key financial aid application timeframe to ensure that you've met as many early deadlines as you can possibly get. Some states and some schools will award some limited aid on a first come, first served basis, and those are usually those deadlines, sometime between Halloween and Valentine's Day. Other areas of mistakes is not using your FSA ID to start the FAFSA form or to sign the FAFSA form. We do struggle getting FSA ID sometimes, or electronic signatures. There is a paper signature that a student can mail in. It's not recommended. I will admit that we've had students mail in paper FAFSAs or paper signature pages, and they get lost in the system and we never see them or hear from them again. So really try everything you can to do the online FAFSA and using the FSA ID to sign that FAFSA. The other one is not using the IRS data retrieval tool. The IRS data retrieval tool links the FAFSA to the IRS taxes filed for that year. Most students are eligible for it and parents, but some are not. For it, use the IRS retrieval tool. That's some of those typos from getting entered when it comes to entering in those tax dollars. And then let's see, the other ones, yeah, not signing the FAFSA form comes back to not using the FSA ID. So a lot of them are, when you think of the top 10, if you fill out the FAFSA online and you sign it, you get it completed and you use the IRS data retrieval tool, your chances of having a mistake on the FAFSA are pretty minuscule. The last thing that I wanted to cover is the idea of professional judgment. This is what financial aid officers have authority to do. It's called professional judgment. It incorporates a bunch of special circumstances that come into play. So everything that we've discussed today is written as a standard, but we all know that students and families don't always meet those standard things. Change happens. We're looking at tax information that could be 2 years old, sometimes 2.5 years old. And so a lot can happen in 2.5 years. There could be a loss in job, reduced pay, divorce, death, births, marriages. These situations happen when we're looking at information that's old. So financial aid officers do have the ability and the authority to adjust information that has been provided on the FAFSA. So for example, we're looking at a student for 23-24. They're being asked to provide their 2021 income. Anytime between January and now, there could have been a parent lost a job. The student and the parent can't go into their FAFSA and correct it with their 2022 income. However, a financial aid officer could make the decision that change in income would make a big difference in the family's ability to pay for college, and therefore go in and make a change to the FAFSA on behalf of the student using their authority as professional judgment. These situations also exist for students who maybe don't meet those definitions of dependency that we talked about. Again, those could be special circumstances. I think we know that there could be people out there who are under the age of 24 who aren't in a legal guardianship, who haven't been considered a ward of the court, who are never in foster care yet, don't have contact with their parents to provide information. And so what do we do with them? They're raised by grandma or by aunts or uncles or cousins or siblings. This is where financial aid office has this authority to review a student's individual circumstance and determine what's going to be in the best interest of that student. And for these, it's really working directly with the financial aid office at the school that the student is thinking about going. And you can work with more than one financial aid office in this case. The student is torn between two schools, work with us, do the process through both schools. It can be cumbersome because there's a lot of documentation that has to go into these things. Really just the opportunity to tell your story, to tell the student's story, and seek assistance from the financial aid office is going to be the best way to go about it. So David asks a question in this case. So parents are divorced at the time of the FAFSA, but the tax return is filed jointly. What do you check for taxes? So in this case, if the parents are divorced at the time that they complete the FAFSA, but they were married and they filed jointly, that's going to be a situation where the parent cannot use the IRS data retrieval tool, and they will have to manually enter the income on the based off of their W-2s, or just being able to split out the income. And again, a financial aid officer can help you through that. And then we do have someone who shared that they encourage everyone to fill out the FAFSA. However, what would you say to the best response when parents say, we make too much money, our son and daughter doesn't qualify for FAFSA? We get this situation quite a bit. And we try to explain that every student, no matter how much money you make, every student is eligible for something in regards to financial aid. Now, it may just be a loan, but they are still eligible for a low interest loan. And it's better to have that FAFSA filed in case you need it than not. But the other thing that we share is there are scholarships out there that just require submission of the FAFSA, and they don't care how much money you make. So this could be, I like to try to find something specific to share with students. And in my area, our Alaska Performance Scholarship, our state scholarship, does not care about the income level on the FAFSA, but requires the FAFSA as the only application process. Another example is when schools had higher education emergency relief funding through COVID, through the federal government. The first round required the FAFSA. It did not matter how much money was on there, but in order to get that COVID relief money, a student had to have had the FAFSA. So check with your schools, with your areas, with your states to find, one example that you can give that this scholarship through this electric company requires the FAFSA. And that's how we often sell the idea of the FAFSA. Of course, there are still going to be people that just refuse to complete it. And there's nothing that we can do other than just share that their student is missing out on aid. Someone asked, what stage in the process should revisions be requested for professional judgment? Should the student do it as soon as they find out, or wait until admissions decision and receiving the financial aid offer letter? I encourage students to at least initiate the conversation with the financial aid office as soon as they know that their situation is different. Something like a dependency override, the FAFSA is actually submitted as incomplete, and the student will never receive a financial aid offer letter until they go through the process of a dependency override and go through that process of professional judgment. For the other ones, such as loss of wages or reduction of income, they may get a financial aid offer letter that is just inaccurate, and doing the professional judgment may adjust what information is actually on that award letter. So I recommend having the conversation with the financial aid officer as soon as they know that the situation is different. Some schools will have deadlines to process professional judgments. Some schools will have deadlines that they are not deadlines, but I guess starting points that they won't accept forms until after a certain date. But the student can still be working on gathering that information if they are talking with a financial aid professional in advance.
Ashley, could I jump in with a question that
Sure.
I've seen a couple of times? So with regard to professional judgment and verification both, if one college makes an adjustment or completes verification, does that apply to the other colleges that the student listed on the FAFSA?
That's a good question. Financial aid officers can have the option to accept another school's dependency override or verification. Most schools do not. There's very few schools that will use this option. Financial aid officers have maybe a little bit of trust issues, and we want to make sure that we have the documentation that we need to support in our annual audits. And some of our decisions will be different. Some schools use professional judgment in a variety of ways. It's all up to the school and the policy that they have written. And so we want to make sure that the student has has met our policy. So we're going to request all of the documentation again. And it's only within an award year. So if a student is flipping between fall and spring, transferring schools, a school has the option to, but I think in all of my work, I've only talked to 2 schools that actually use that flexibility. Most schools do not. Let's see, there's another question here. Can the FAFSA and the need for aid hurt a student's chance of being accepted into college? I'm actually going to throw this one to Palmer as the admissions office representative. I don't think so, but Palmer, can you answer that question?
I can't answer it authoritatively because I've only worked at a few schools, but I'll say that I think the answer is no. But there's always a concern on folks' part about this. Every school that I've been at, the admission decision was completely disconnected from the financial aid decisions. It didn't mean the offices didn't talk to one another, but there was no impact one way or the other as far as whether a student was offered admission.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And I will say I've not come across a school where this is the case. That doesn't mean that there's not a tough conversation coming at some point. We often have conversations with students, even once they're admitted. They may be admitted, but it's, let's talk about your finances. Can you afford to come here realistically? And sometimes the answer is no. And we will do our best to be completely honest, open, and transparent with the student when we have those conversations. But it's not linked to their admissions decision. It is just linked to their, let's be realistic here. You're going to have a bill that you don't have a way to pay. And what can we do about that? We are coming up to the end of our time here, and I don't see any other questions. So we'll just kind of, I'll wait here to look for another question, but also put up my contact information.
And Ashley, I actually had a couple of questions that I personally had, so
Sure.
that I thought might be of help to some folks. What should counselors tell their students to do if they're applying to more than 10 colleges and the FAFSA only allows 10 colleges to be listed?
In that case, I would say list their, prioritize them a little bit, list their top 10, maybe the ones that have early admissions deadlines that they're trying to meet. Once you have your 10, you can go back into the FSA user portal and add additional schools, but the initial application can only include 10.
And then do you have any generic advice for counselors who are working with non-citizens?
Oh, that's tough.
Yeah.
Some states do have good DACA or DREAM programs that allow for state aid to be used. Some schools also have that. That's really going to be a conversation that is going to be very state and school specific. There's not a lot of information or aid available through the federal government. The student can still complete the FAFSA using an alien registration number or whatever number they may have, depending upon their citizenship status, to try to get the FAFSA in to see what they may be eligible for, or to see, to have that student aid report for other scholarships. But there's not going to be a whole lot in regards to federal aid. It's going to be more of what is available through your state. And some states do have separate applications. California, Oregon, and Washington, I know of, that have their own separate application for students who are not citizens.
I see Shannon had a question here about tips for scholarships, and she wrote, we often see students lose aid from the school if they get outside scholarships, leading to a net zero gain for earning scholarships. The advice she's received in Washington is for students to try and find scholarships that will cover housing.
Yeah,
I'm not sure that that's as broadly true as, but go ahead, Ashley.
Yeah, there is a limit to the amount of student financial aid that's available. And there's also some programs that lots of programs want to be the last dollar spent. Some things like the Promise programs, which is what Washington has, although I don't think it's actually called Promise, but it's a Promise program, guarantees that they'll cover tuition and fees, and any scholarships that come in for tuition and fees count against that. Washington, the state, will make sure that the difference is covered. And so some scholarships do cut into their ability for other scholarships. There's really no way around that, but you're right. Looking for scholarships that are more generic than tuition and fees could be a benefit to those particular students.
I'm realizing that our participants can't see the Q&A. And so there's a couple of comments here that might be helpful just to verbalize that Washington State has the Fafsa for undocumented students, so they can access student aid. Thanks, Shannon. And then Adriano says, Immigrants Rising is a great resource for DACA students. Immigrants Rising. Someone else said, the dream.us scholarships may be options for undocumented students. It's the website is thedream.us. And then Brandy added that Oregon has the ORSA, ORSAA form. So, and with that, we probably should wrap up, right, Ray? Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I took a picture of those questions, or those resources that people shared in the Q&A, and I think we can send that out with the email that goes out next week. So for those of you that maybe joined us later, unfortunately, Patrick couldn't join us today. And so we appreciate Ashley for, at the very last minute, agreeing to present for us. Ashley, this was huge. Thank you so much. I learned so much from you, Ashley, and actually from the other participants. You guys asked questions that I didn't even know that I needed to ask and know the answer to. So thank you. So helpful. But so again, this is being recorded and we will send it out to all of you in an email, those of you that signed up for this webinar. But please note, there is about a week delay in getting this to all the participants. But like I said, also, we'll try to list these resources that you shared in that email that goes out probably early next week. And then I just wanted to say December 14th is our next webinar in this series. And the webinar is connecting students with scholarship opportunities, which I think is going to be another great one. So thank you all for joining us. Did you have anything last minute, Palmer?
No, thank you very much. It was exciting for us to see all of you come in, and we are enjoying bringing this webinar series to you on behalf of PNACAC.
Yes.
Thanks again, Ashley.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley.
Thank you. It's nice talking with you all this morning.
Yep. Have a great day, everyone.